Good afternoon, everyone. It's 3 o'clock, so we will get started on today's webinar. Just to make sure that everyone can hear me, if you could hear me, could you raise your hand, please? Oh, fantastic. All right, you can all hear me. And just another check, can you all see on your screen the Leaders as Strategists webinar? Yeah? Awesome. Don't you just love it when technology works as it's supposed to? I do a lot of these remote meetings and Zoom and Skype meetings, and I reckon at least a third of them we have technical difficulties, but touch wood, these webinars always seem to pretty much work. So how good is that? All right, everyone, welcome this afternoon. It is fantastic to have you all here today to talk a little bit about strategic leadership. So I'm Alicia Mackay, and I'm really excited actually to run this one. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I've been seeing a lot of these issues pop up in the work that I've been doing with teams over the last couple of months. And I'm starting to get the idea that this is actually one of the key ways that we're kind of letting our managers or letting our leaders down a little bit from a development perspective. So I'm a bit wary of the word leadership, and I usually try and avoid it actually because I think it's becoming one of those buzzwords. It's one of those really trendy things at the moment that's getting a lot of attention, and rightly so, because we've realised that if we want to have effective teams and successful organisations, it's actually really important for the people at the top to be really effective and good at what they do. But we are bandying the word leadership around a lot, and it seems to be encompassing everything from management right through to self-actualization. So usually a bit wary on it, but look, here we go. We'll give it a crack today. I think where leadership is concerned, we've actually come quite a long way in quite a short time in most places, and it's worth remembering that when we start to poke holes at where we're not quite there yet. I think we have sort of come to understand that just because you're an expert at what you do and what you know doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a great leader, which is great progress. And I've noticed, especially over the last few years, that we've done a lot of work around people and culture. So we know that if we can figure out how to get the most out of our teams, we can boost the impact of our people, which is great. But I do think we've got a way to go on this one, though, and I think that there are still a whole bunch of skills that we consider to be innate or intuitive rather than learned. And so when it comes to making good decisions and responding to change and thinking big picture, we still sort of expect that seniority just by virtue of itself will deliver on that. But like most things, these are actually learned skills. And if we don't invest in them, we don't see them appear like magic, unfortunately. So I've done a lot of work with quite technical teams lately, which might be why this is front of mind for me. So scientists and academics and PhDs, really super talented, bright people. And one of the things I've noticed in these workplaces is that when we promote on the basis of subject matter expertise, it can be particularly tricky, because when these people need to sit around the exec table and give really good direction to their teams and make decisions about strategy in the future, it can be quite challenging to get up out of that detail-focused headspace and think big picture. Now, do any of you on the call today work in places where you've got leaders who've been promoted based on their expertise and seem to struggle when they're around the top table? Raise your hand if that's something you've... Oh, wow, okay. Yeah, cool, which is probably why you're here. Awesome. Well, good thing you're here then. And I mean, I'd be really keen to hear, if we try the chat feature out, what do you think is difficult about that? What are some of the problems that you see in your organisations when you've got really bright technical people that wind up around the leadership table? Well, I'll tell you what I see. And I see a lot of quite detail-focused leaders who are really knowledgeable about the teams that they're leading and the work that they're doing. And what I'm seeing is that their time becomes disproportionately allocated to worrying about the details of projects and providing oversight and accuracy and getting involved. And what that means is that there is less time available and less space and bandwidth available to do the big picture thinking. Oh, I've got some contributions here. Yeah, deep diving in the weeds. Absolutely, Damon. Justifying what's been done, not seeing what needs to happen in the future. Amanda, that's such a great comment. And actually, when I think about that, I think of it a little bit like talking to your in-laws or your parents about raising children, because I don't know how many of you on the call today have kids, but the prevailing wisdom and the advice on what to do with babies and what to do with kids has had an absolutely massive shift over the last, there's 10 years between my eldest and my youngest, so even in that decade, the change is huge. And trying to have conversations about what to do there with a generation or two removed is really difficult, not just because the wisdom or the evidence has changed, but because tackling some of those behaviours looks like a criticism or a threat to what's been done in the past. So when you want to move forward and look at change and you want to change the way teams are doing things, if you're a leader that's come up in that environment, it can be really difficult not to see that as a criticism of the way that you've done things in the past. So I think that's a really great point, Amanda. Yeah, and not knowing how to do the big picture thinking. And not knowing how is exactly the right way to put it, because if we're not taught to do that, and if we've spent all of our development energy on expertise on the details, how could we be expected to know how to do it? So look, while it's obviously really important that people in those kind of environments do have the knowledge to make really good technical decisions and provide that oversight, getting stuck in those details or just focusing on team dynamics and the people stuff can be problematic. So just quickly, here's how today's going to run. I'm going to spend the next hour or so looking at what being a strategist, a leader as a strategist is all about, and how it's different to the other kinds of leadership that we've traditionally invested in. I've got some quite practical advice today around the ways that we can be more strategic as leaders. And what I'm going to do as we go through is just a bit more of what I've done just now. So I'm going to ask you questions and ask you to chuck your hands up or respond to me using the chat box, which just makes the whole thing a little bit more fun. And it means that I can check in that what I'm talking about is useful for you guys. So hopefully everyone's cool with that. I'm going to talk about being a strategic leader and how moving up the ladder towards that strategic skill set can benefit our teams and our organisations and help us to have more impact. So we've got an hour together and I'm going to get through everything I can in that time. I do move quite quickly. Those of you that come to these regularly will know I do speak quite quickly. That's how I roll. And that means it may not all land with you the first time. So take notes, take in what you can, but there will also be a recording made available via email and also on YouTube, where all my webinars are. Towards the end of our time together, I'm also going to tell you about how I help teams and leaders to upskill on this stuff, which you might find quite interesting if this is something that your workplace potentially needs to put more energy into. And I'll also open up for some Q&A toward the end. So feel free to chuck those in the chat box as we go, or hold on to them until we get to that point, and I will do my best to answer you. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen this report, but the World Economic Forum published the results from their Future of Jobs survey late last year. And there's so much gold in this report. Every time I pick it up, I pull something else out of it. It's really fascinating. It's worth having a look at. So one thing that this report looked at, the skills that we're going to need in the future to add real value in the workplace. And what I particularly like about this graph that I've extracted and some of the other data in that report is that it's not talking future like hovercraft 2045 type future. It's actually looking, in some instances, just 3 to 5 years out at some of the stuff that is changing and what we might need. And the shift in just a few years of what we see coming is really quite astonishing. And there's another part of that report that looks at the size of the training gap at the moment. So that's the gap in our workplaces to actually invest in those skills. And the gap in New Zealand and in Oceania is particularly high. So it's definitely worth having a look at, especially if you're in a people and culture or L&D role. And so obviously, we're talking a lot about the future of work at the moment, almost as much as we talk about leadership. And something we know with reasonable confidence is that we are going to see a whole lot of stuff automated. And most of this automation seems to be taking place in the technical and rules-based sphere of work. Now, if you're interested in this stuff, an American economist, J. Bradford DeLong, wrote a really great paper on this quite recently called "Why Are There Still So Many Jobs?" So I can send a link out to that with the recording if you like. And the gist of that paper is sort of that, yes, we are going to see increasing automation and machine working over the next few years. Just like the industrial revolution saw manual production shift into that machine-oriented environment, the AI revolution is going to see lots of technical tasks moving away from traditional labour sources. And there's this great sort of model that DeLong uses that has 10 varieties of work on it when we think about the way that people operate in a labour setting and create economic value from their work. And so this ladder kind of starts at the bottom looking at, manual labour and just really quite physical tasks, and then kind of steps through to more technical tasks, to working with information, to communicating, right up to thinking. And what's really interesting, and what DeLong argues, is that there's a tipping point where it actually becomes really difficult to automate, which is his response to that question of why there's still so many jobs. And that point seems to be where we think about two particular kinds of skills, and one is relational skills and the other is strategic skills. So when it comes to working with people, those things are obviously quite difficult to automate for lots of reasons, but one of them is because humans are just not very sensible. So there's so much tacit and social and cultural knowledge that we need access to work with people well. And this stuff is really quite hard to capture in a series of rules that we can automate, because no matter how rational we think we are, it turns out we're pretty all over the place. And so those communication and coordination tasks remain really high on that ladder value-wise. And actually, I think this is something that we've done quite a good job at recognising. Who's noticed a real push over the last few years to upskilling people on emotional intelligence and communication skills? Raise your hands if that's something you've seen a lot of in your area. Yeah, most of you. Cool. But right at the top of that ladder are strategic skills. And so these skills are about reasoning and decision making, which you'll see at the top of that World Economic Forum graph in front of you there. And they're about understanding and interpreting information from lots of different sources, and then using that information to make forward-looking decisions about the future, which is really interesting because we're not necessarily able to be predictive about what good direction setting looks like until we see it, or until we see the results of that direction setting, which makes automation really difficult. So I read something recently that said that creativity is all about making unseen or previously unseen connections. And I think that's exactly what strategy is all about. It's about uncovering those unseen connections and using those to make choices about how we should behave and how we should approach things and what position we should take as we tackle the future. And the other reason that automation in this space is really tricky is because it's all about context. And context is shifting so rapidly. So as soon as we try to program contextual information into some kind of data set for automation, we realise that we missed something really important, or that by the time we got it in there, it's just shifted on us. So creating rules around that is extremely difficult, which I think is why reasoning and decision making sits right at the top of that graph, is where we're going to see the smallest shift towards machine working. And actually, I've heard that it's also one of those reasons why automated vehicles are proving so much more difficult than we first thought it would be. So when it comes to the variables that we understand, like the road and the weather and the car, that's all fine, we've got that. But it's those non-rational decisions that people make, and things like the way that emotions impact our driving choices, and trying to account for how to respond in a machine way to that behaviour, which is quite unpredictable, which is so hard. So right at the top of this graph is reasoning and decision making, and this is the part of the skill set inside that kind of skill matrix that the World Economic Forum expects to see the smallest shift over the next few years, and that's for the next kind of 3 to 5, but also looking out further. And obviously the prediction is as good as the model, but for now, with what we know, these seem to be the skills that are going to add the most value from a people-based standpoint. So when I think about this from an organisational setting and the people that work within an organisation, I see these very distinct styles of leadership playing out. And if you look at this ladder, it's likely that you'll kind of recognise quite quickly that there are multiple types of leaders inside every organisation, and that there are different places where those different skill sets are the most appropriate to lead with. And that's okay. You know, we've got different people at different levels for different reasons. But as we shift up the ladder, and as we shift up in seniority inside an organisation, we have different expectations and different requirements. And the problem is when we've got top tier leaders, you know, your 1 to 4, who need to be working at the top of that ladder. And as Damon quite rightly pointed out at the start of the call, when they get stuck down in the weeds. Has anyone ever worked with a senior leader who seems to be overly focused on those bottom 2 levels, the technical and operational? Raise your hands if that's something you've experienced. Yeah, I'm not surprised to see that. It's really common. And it's common particularly in organisations where we have lots of super bright people, like I was saying before. I have a bit of a theory on this because I think we went a little bit wrong and when it comes to career progression, and we've seemed to have created this kind of merit or promotion system that has people management and executive management as the primary way to move ahead, to have career advancement. And I think that really disadvantages subject matter experts and technical specialists who love what they do and they're really ambitious, but they can't see their options for progression without moving ahead into those kind of ranks. So I think that's quite problematic. So when we have an operational or a technical skill set, which are those 2 levels down the bottom, we see leaders who are more focused on accuracy and on delivery, so that's kind of the getting things done, that task focus, than anything else. So they're still in the weeds, because they want to be. That's where they want to be. They didn't see any other options, so they're a manager now, but they still want to play there. It's the stuff they love, and this causes real challenges in an environment where we've got other people who are supposed to be getting on with that work, the people they're leading, their teams. And the line between oversight and meddling can get a bit blurred. And so you'll see the next level there is that relational skill set, which I think has been the big focus over the last decade or so. So it took us a while to twig, but we realised that if we invest in our leaders' abilities to get the most out of their people and look after them and build a culture where people want to come to work, then we see some real results. And this is that people management piece, which is so important. And I don't deny that for a second. But there's a tipping point, I think, when we shift from that relational skill set into that organisational management or organisational leadership. And that's where we see the focus start to take on those big picture characteristics. So we're not just thinking about what's happening in our team for our people, but we're starting to operate above the parapet a bit. And we start to see leaders emerging here who are more conscious of the moving parts and how they work together. So this is really great for building some real productivity and effectiveness in a team, but also across teams as well. So this is where we see a focus on systems and putting people into the right roles to do the right jobs and creating workflows and patterns and ways of doing things that work better than just kind of a collection of ad hoc stuff. And I think this is where that leadership impact starts to really pick up. So if I was plotting this on a curve, it would start to get quite steep at this point because we start to see real value. And we're really starting to see training and development picking up in this zone. So it's all that systems thinking type stuff. And it is one of those things that if we invest in, we get a real payoff for. And it's hard to do because it means that we're asking leaders to both lead their teams, but also then turn up to a different table with a different hat on and do their exec team or their organisational wide thinking. I've got to say though, like we do make this kind of training horrendously dry as a rule. I don't know if that resonates with you guys, but like we only used to do that systems thinking piece with policy people and maybe business analysts. And there's still a real hangover from that, so it still looks quite flow charty. I was talking to an agency recently about some leadership training, and they've got a full week of systems thinking planned for their Tier 4s next year. And I've got to say, my heart goes out to them a little bit because like half a day of this stuff and I'm getting foggy. A full week, that's a lot. Okay, so right at the top of this tier, purple stuff, this is what I'm talking about today and what I'm talking about here. And it's that higher order thinking stuff, which I think we've treated as quite magical and quite instinctive until recently, which is just a bit mad. So I think there's a few things in life that we treat like magic, art, music, and I think decision-making or strategy sits up there as well. So we kind of just think that people are either born creative or not. They're musical or they're not. They've got good judgment or leadership abilities or they don't, which is just a bit dumb, to be honest, because there may not be the kind of black and white rules stuff here that we can automate, but there are so many muscles to build and practices to embed here that makes such a big difference, and we just don't need to treat them as some kind of God-given ability. It's like just because you've become senior over the last 5 years doesn't mean that you just kind of woke up with the ability to make great decisions and think big picture, and it's actually not fair on people to expect that they have. So the key difference between those top two, so there is that tipping point from relational to organisational, but the key difference between those top two is this idea of context. So context starts kicking in at the organisational level when people are kind of able to take off their my team, my stuff silo type hat and start to think across the board about what's better for everyone. But it's still quite internally focused, so it's internal context. So the big difference between the organisational leadership and the strategic leadership skill sets are the ability to keep an eye up and keep an eye out. So this is figuring out how what's going on out there relates to what's going on in here. So what are the social shifts that impact our license to operate? What are the expectations of our community and our customers that we need to be more aware of? What are the ways that people are communicating and interacting and transacting that we need to be aware of and stay ahead of to be relevant? You know, how do we get prepared for the big economic and environmental shifts, for automation, for climate change? How do we keep adding value when other people's behaviour, the behaviour of our competitors, the behaviour of your new generation, of our stakeholders, as their behaviour changes, what do we need to do? Because when we don't keep an eye on that stuff, the world kind of sneaks up on us, and it's a bit of a surprise. Does that all make sense? Do you think that the leaders in your organisations at the moment are hitting that strategic level? Like sometimes, maybe, not at all? Let me know in the chat box where you think your organisations are at the moment. I won't out you. Okay, so a bit of a spread. Sometimes, nope. Yeah, and that's about right. That's about what we'd expect. So the first point I want to make about transitioning to a more strategic leadership skill set, sometimes, yeah, stronger at the cultural level but struggling with some systems. That's interesting. The first point to make here is that strategy is actually your job. So at a certain point of seniority, strategy becomes your job. And those of you that attend a lot of these webinars, and it's so lovely actually to see so many of your names here again today that I see other times. I do feel like we're starting to be mates now. This is quite nice. What you'll have heard me say a lot is that strategy is everyone's job. And it is, and I stand by that. And everyone plays an important role in contributing to the big picture, all the way to the front line. And if we don't have that alignment and we don't have everybody playing their part, it falls over. But the difference between being a senior leader and being a frontline staff member, a lot of it really comes down to how you spend your time. So the way that we allocate our time becomes particularly important as we advance in seniority and as the value we're paid for and expected to deliver advances with that, which is kind of paradoxical because this is the point where we actually stop tracking our time and thinking of units of time. But taking the time to evaluate the big picture and tap into context and to think about the big choices you're facing and the direction that you want to head in and how you want to change and how you want to tweak how things work. At a certain level, these are not luxury tasks that we just kind of fit in when we can manage it. They're not the jobs that we need to be leaving for quarterly away days or annual retreats. These are the most important things that you do in your work. And the more senior your position, the more margin and the more strategy space you actually need. It's literally what you're paid to do. And I find myself kind of validating and coaching leaders through this often because there's this little bit of guilt we get. And I think that's maybe particular to the public sector where we've spent our whole careers trying to make it look like we're not on a junket, and that we are spending our time well. And we have this level of guilt that comes in about, doing a bit of navel gazing and thinking big picture. But actually, at a certain point, this is exactly what our job is. And the good news is that the more of that space we're able to create, the more impact we can have and the more successful we're likely to be. So the obvious question here is how much time? Right? How much time, Alicia? How much do I need? And the answer is somewhere between 10 and 40% of your time. It's huge, right? So Michael Porter, who the strategy nerds among you will know is the father of modern strategy thinking, Michael Porter went and followed some super successful CEOs for 13 weeks. And he did that to figure out how they were spending their time, to kind of get an answer to that question. So he followed 27 chief executives of billion-dollar companies, and what he found is that on average, each chief executive spent 43% of their time on activities that, and I quote, furthered their business. So that's that cliche about working on rather than in the business. And that included about half an hour every day, every morning to be specific, of strategizing and planning. So on average, these chief executives spent at least half an hour every morning before they touched their emails, before they picked up a phone call, before they talked to their people, doing that strategy and planning work. Now, it's also worth telling you, actually, because I quite like this, that the most successful chief executives in that group were also really diligent about the time that they spent away from work. So they spent an average of 45 minutes a day on exercise, which I thought was amazing. They slept an average of 7 hours a night, which was really surprising to me as well, because I think we'll see a lot of these, Elon Musk type articles where we think that in order to be at the top, you've got to sleep 3 hours a night and get up at 4 o'clock in the morning or whatever. But no, these guys, they spent an average of 45 minutes a day on exercise, 7 hours a night sleeping. They spent an average of 3 hours a day with their families, which I thought was fantastic. And then get this one, 2 hours a day on personal pastimes, 2 hours a day. So if you've got it in your head that the more senior you are, the more hours you have to put in, and that when I talk about time allocation, I just mean spend more time at your desk, like you can knock that one on the head. That is absolutely not how it works. It is quality over quantity here. And we know this, right? Like we know that when we get breakthroughs, that they're sudden and that they're fast. And we know that we have those days where we get more done in 2 hours than we do in 2 weeks sometimes, if we're in the right headspace and thinking about the right stuff. But for some reason, we do still insist on treating our units of time as though they're equal, but that's absolutely not how it works. So at this level, strategy is your job. Now, this all might sound a little bit ambitious. So for those of you who are hearing me say, exercise for 45 minutes and sleep for 7 hours and take hours a day to strategize, it's okay. Take heed. There is some really good evidence to suggest that even if we can hit the 90-10 rule, so if we can spend 10% of our time in strategic thought, then we see a really obvious benefit. And I know that sounds better, that 10%, but that's still half a day a week. It's 2 days a month. That's a full week every quarter. So if that seems crazy to any of you, it might be time to think about shifting that balance. Now just get quick hands up. Who thinks they're currently achieving at least that 90-10, that half a day a week on strategizing? Put your hand up if you are. That's 1, 2, 2 of you. All right. Okay, well, I'm glad you're here. Okay, so remember on that ladder that I showed you earlier, the difference between the organisational skill set and the strategic skill set was all about context. So this means staying connected and staying aware of what's happening outside the building, outside your team, outside your organisation. And so this one is about sticking your head above the parapet and working out your place in the world and what the next step needs to be to keep adding value. It's that I forward thing that Amanda mentioned before. So we know the cliches about, Blockbuster didn't see Netflix coming, Kodak wasn't prepared for the digital camera. And I get that, but I think the point that's worth making there is it's not just that they didn't look outside. Like, I'm sure these are bright people that are heading up these organisations, right? And I'm sure they noticed the internet. Like, they noticed that the technology changed. The ticket here is about being able to spot the intersection between what's happening out there and what's happening in here. So what does that stuff potentially mean for us in our position? So what? How can this stuff impact us or our stakeholders or our market or our community? So the strategic leader isn't just keeping an eye out. I know plenty of senior leaders who are doing all the right things here. You know, they're having the right coffees, they're going to the right conferences, they're reading the right stuff. The strategic skill set is about operating right at the top of that future of jobs spectrum and being able to work out what the potential meaning of those changes and those trends and all of that information is. And that's why we can't automate it, right? So this is that creativity thing about making the unseen connections. So the strategic skill set is about being able to translate that information, make the connections, and then this is the kicker, use that to make decisions. So to find a way through complexity and then be brave enough and decisive enough to actually make choices on that basis. Because knowing it's not enough, writing the report's not enough. There's a really great book called The Strategist. I'm trying to remember who it's by. Cynthia someone. That's poor form, isn't it? I have to put that in the notes too. And she talks about a shift where strategy seemed to move from implementation to formulation. Does that make sense? So it's the idea that somewhere along the line, when we put more attention on strategy, we made it more about thinking about it and putting it together and putting it in a report than we did actually taking action on that basis. And I think that's really relevant here. Like, you look outside, be aware, but unless we're using that information and making meaning from it and making choices on it, that's not strategy at all. It's just research. Does this resonate with you guys? Check your hands up if this is making sense. Yeah, cool. Awesome. So having that awareness and making that meaning and making those decisions are super, super important. However, it's all kind of a waste of time if we're not providing direction for our teams. So I opened day 2 of a local government conference down in Christchurch yesterday, which was great. And we had a few really good crowd questions. And one of the questions that I was asked, which was a real goodie, was about what comes first, strategy or people? It's contentious, right? What do you think I answered to that one? Actually, I've got a wee poll on this one. Can everyone see the poll? This is anonymous. No one's going to know what you put. What do you think comes first, strategy or people? Oh, results are coming in. Should we get a few more? Still a bunch of you that haven't voted. Go on. Ah, this is interesting. Okay. 50-50. Look at that, guys. Literally 50-50. That's fascinating. Well, my answer, and you probably guessed this based on what I do for a job, but my answer was strategy. And I'll tell you why. So I think that this is the ticket in moving up that ladder from the relational leadership skill set. So people and culture is so, so important. And if we don't have engaged, motivated teams who are happy to come to work, it's really hard to make good stuff happen. But what people need to be engaged and be happy and be motivated is purpose and a clear sense of direction. So when I work with teams that tell me that their first priority is people, that the first thing that they worry about and put first and plan for is people, I'm always a little bit cynical because I sort of think, well, Do we establish an organisation so that people can come here and be happy? Or do we establish a team or an organisation to achieve something and then make sure that people are motivated and happy in making that happen? So I talk about the difference between directive and facilitative leadership quite a lot. So when do we need to tell, when do we need to ask, and when do we need to support? And I'm a little bit unpopular for this view sometimes, but I genuinely believe that in a lot of places, the pendulum has swung too far from that old kind of command and control style, which obviously nobody wants, all the way across to quite an over-consultative approach. So we put a lot of energy at the leadership table into working out what we need to do. And then we undermine the whole thing by going out and saying, oh, guys, what do you think? Is this okay? Have we missed anything? Do you like it? I mean, I see a lot of articles and people talking about how people are afraid of change. In fact, people tell me this in workshops all the time. Oh, look, you know, guys aren't good with change. They've had a lot of change. They don't feel good about change. But the evidence on this one actually suggests that the way people process change, people are fine with change. It's uncertainty that's the problem. So what's scary about change is actually what it might mean for us and how we'll cope. And when we don't have anything to grab onto, and it's just this kind of amorphous idea of future disruption, that's quite destabilising. But the more certainty we have about where we're going and our role in it, and so the more certainty that leadership can provide us, the happier people actually are to kind of rock on and grapple with it. And we underestimate that sometimes. And if you're a leader with any seniority in your organisation, that's your job. So your job is to provide that clarity of direction, and not in an authoritarian, do what I say, kind of know-it-all kind of way. Like, humility is really important here, and authenticity is really important. So I'm not saying that we make out like we've got everything locked down when we kind of are grappling with change ourselves. But what we can do, if we've made really good strategic decisions, is to be very clear about, here's what's going on, here's how we have chosen to respond and what's going to happen, here's what I need from you, now tell me what that means for you. Does that make sense? So being strategic means picking a direction and being really clear about it. And I do a lot of these strategy workshops where I do the first bit with the exec team, and we do that kind of direction setting piece. And then we go out and pressure test it. So we talk to tier 3s and 4s, and we talk to staff from across agency or across organisation, and we do the pressure test and say, you know, does this make sense? What does this mean for you and your work? And before I go out, almost without exception, the exec teams are saying, oh, we're going to be really careful about how we message this. You know, people are really, they've had so much change, they're over it. We're going to worry them if we give them a new direction. And pretty much every time without fail, that is not at all the experience that I have. People are ready to get on with it. They want to have more impact. They just want some clarity about what it is that's expected of them and where they're going. I kind of think it's a bit like a diet. Like, it doesn't really matter which method you pick. What matters is that you pick one and you stick with it, and then you know what to avoid on that basis. And so by and large, I've got tier 3s, tier 4s, all the way down to frontline staff telling me, just give us the direction so we can get on and do it. Give us some clarity. Tell us what we can say no to. Raise your hand if that resonates with you. Yeah. Whoa. Okay, that's the biggest response yet. Awesome. Okay. How many of you have seen my actionable strategy model before? Yeah, a few of you. Awesome. So the same steps that are important for developing good strategy, and good strategy that becomes action, that implementation, not formulation, remember, those same steps come into play when we're talking about strategic leadership, which makes sense, right? So the first one is that clarity of direction for our people. And we've just had a bit of a chat about that. And the next one that coherent stuff, which when we talk about strategy, we're talking about aligning business process and policy and all that kind of stuff. In this context, for leadership, it's about creating the right conditions for success. And those of you who felt very uncomfortable when I was talking about directive leadership will feel much better here, because this is where your facilitative leadership style becomes more appropriate. So, not at the point where we're giving the direction. So we can almost think about that as providing, the shelter, the safety, the certainty of a home to go to, of a home base. But then when we get to this point, we kind of acknowledge that, like, our house is in a perpetual state of renovation. If anyone lives in a house like that or has got friends that do, we're always under construction here. We're always grappling change. And so what people need is the scaffolding to make it safe, to make it possible to do that change well and to improve. So your role in this is not to get stuck in the delivery, which is the tendency of some, and we've talked about that. It's not to go and meddle at the task level or to be part of the action on the ground. It's actually to get out of the way. And not just to get out of the way, but to get other stuff out of the way. So when we talked about organisational leadership, we talked about systems, and this bit's kind of hitting those two markers. So it's your people culture focus from relational leadership, and it's the system stuff. So it's about setting everything up so that it's easier to do the right thing than anything else. And policy, we call this a nudge. So things like compulsory superannuation is a good example of that. It's easier, in fact, almost mandatory to do the right thing so people save more for retirement, hands down. And I don't know how many leaders I've worked with who are frustrated by the lack of progress or the lack of strategy in their team. But when we point to what some of those barriers are, like IT or policy or finance or procurement, they don't want to change the rules. They don't want to make it easy. And it's kind of baffling to me, because what we know is that focusing our attention on killing those bottlenecks instead of breathing down people's necks about navigating those bottlenecks is such a smarter and more strategic use of your time. Put up your hand if you've read The Goal. You ever read The Goal by Alicia or heard of it? Okay. Oh, yeah. Oh, awesome. Yeah, it was really trendy for a bit there. I'm not surprised to see so many of you. So it's a bit 80s. It's a bit like American 80s management style. It's not my favourite book in the world, but the principles in it are really great. And it's set in a manufacturing environment. So this guy heads up a factory, and then they sort of use his personal life as a metaphor for what's happening in the factory at the same time. But the idea is that if you eliminate the slowest parts of any process, if you put all of your attention into killing the slowest part of any process, that's where you see the biggest gains, the biggest impact, and people inevitably work better and feel better when you take those bottlenecks out of the way. So back to that people versus strategy thing. It's more helpful for culture than putting a list of values in the staff room? Making it easy for people to do a good job. So if we go back to that actionable strategy for a minute, so we've talked about clarity, we've looked at that coherence around conditions. That last piece in the puzzle is commitment, and there's lots in that. But in the context of our own leadership, this is where I think we need to get a bit meta. So leadership alone is not enough. Doing the right thing is not enough. So strategic leadership, I've said from the beginning, it's all about context, remember? And so that means not just thinking about the implications of what's going on outside of us and outside of our building, but it's actually thinking about the implications of everything that we do. So it's not just doing the right thing, but being seen to do the right thing. And this is why that time allocation and that responsibility is so different as a strategic leader, because you're not just aware of your context, you're not just a passive player, you're actually creating it. So you're creating context by providing clarity to make things happen, and by channeling all of that energy of your team and your organisation into that direction. And you're providing it by creating an internal context that nudges and facilitates the right behaviour. But you're also providing it by being really intentional and considered about your own behaviour and what that means. So strategic leadership is visible leadership. It's like that old parenting cliche, do what I say, not what I do. So asking people to take risks and then being too afraid to push back on our board or our chief executive or our exec team doesn't work. People see that, right? Or expecting people to prioritise better and to lead change in their teams, but then getting trapped in our own busy work and not getting our own stuff done, it sends a message. So every time we behave in ways that are consistent with our big picture and our overall messaging, and every time we do that in an obvious way, we're creating that context. And the impact of that is so much higher than anything that we can put in a memo or on the wall. So this is a good point for questions, for a few minutes of questions before I shift on. So if you've been hanging on to one, I'd love to see your questions in the chat box. And I know we had a couple in here before. I know I had a question from you there, Amanda, and I'm just trying to jump up and find it. Okay. When uncovering unseen information and making those connections, how do you discern what will be important? Oh, that's such a good question. So I could spend the rest of the day talking to you about that one, but that's such a good point. So I don't know if you've seen some of my work, Amanda, around priorities and strategic focus, but what's really important when we're taking in information from outside of our team or outside of our organisation is knowing which lens to apply. So how do we filter what's relevant to our stuff? And we should do that through the lens of the impact that we're trying to have. So that's that outcome stuff, and where we play. So where do we have influence? Where do we have relationships? What are the big problems that we're trying to solve? And what is the impact that we're trying to have? And if we use that as the criteria for our lens, so does this potentially have an impact on where we want to get outcome-wise? Is this relevant to the big problems that we're trying to solve? Do we have the skills and the relationships to do something in this zone with this information? If we use that as criteria, it becomes a lot easier to figure out what's relevant to us. And that's really, really hard to do. In fact, that's impossible to do if we haven't got some good clarity about what our priorities and our outcomes are in the first place. And this is exactly why we do that strategy before people thing here. Because if we don't have clarity about who we are, what we're doing and why we're doing it, we don't know what's relevant. We don't know what to keep an eye on. So that's awesome. That's a great question. Do you have any other questions? Oh, I like your comment, Kim, about jumping between levels. I think you're right. I don't think it's that you're one kind of person that lives at one level on that leadership ladder. It's more like, depending on where you show up and how you're feeling and what the problem you're tackling is, depends on the kind of skill set that you apply. And you're right, being invited to a strategy session means that you should know that this is the time for the big picture. And you would hope that you do see that. But I would have to say that I do definitely still work with teams that should be showing up with their organisational and their strategic hats on, but are still struggling, actually, to get out of that operational zone. A question from Tiffany. How do you circumnavigate leaders who don't have any strategic intent or skills ever? So these are your leaders and you're seeking clarity, but struggling to get them, or struggling to get it, rather. Yeah, that is particularly difficult. And trying to be strategic in an environment where the conditions are not favourable, like we talked about before, is a real challenge. And what that means is that we have to start leading conversations to provide us with what we need. So I think there's still room to influence there, and you can still apply the same principles about clarity and about coherence, but we've got to be really quite clear in our conversations about what we're looking for. So being able to say, what are the top 3 priorities for our team this year? How can you support me to remove these bottlenecks that I've identified so that we can move forward? How can I show my teams, or how can you support me to show my team that this is the stuff that matters? So it's almost like guerrilla strategy, influencing from the ground up. Hopefully that's been helpful. Okay, so that was a lot in one go, as I promised. And I did promise that at the start of the webinar, I would give you everything I could in the time we had, and then talk to you about how you could get more help. So the recording of this webinar will be made available at the end, which means you can go back and watch and run through and share it with your teams, which is great. From a help perspective, I run a program and I'm excited about it because this is pulling together lots of the conversations that I have in strategy workshops and actually putting it together into a particular leadership program, despite my aversion or allergy to the word leadership. So it's called Leaders as Strategists, and it's a 1-day kickstart on all the stuff that I've been talking about today. So I'm not running it publicly. I do, for now, just run it in-house, which is great because it means that we get a really good feel for where your team needs the help. So we can work with anything from exec teams that need a bit of polishing all the way through to technical experts that actually need to start their journey, like right down the bottom of that skill set ladder. I do also work with teams on bigger, longer term programs to upskill their top tier managers over a longer period of time. And those are a bit more complicated. So we think about masterclasses and coaching and resources and that kind of thing. But the 1-day intensive is a really great way to kickstart that thinking, to kickstart our relationship as well. So I kind of think of my client relationships a little bit like dating, so we need to do this first date together to figure out where the hotspots are and see what we might need to do in the future. And I don't think we need to go to a full marriage commitment on the first date. So I'm fully booked for 2019 here on this program, but I am looking at 2020 bookings now. So if you've been thinking about how to support or upskill your team or your leaders, or you're in an L&D role thinking about development and leadership for next year, I'd love to talk to you about how we could work together. So you can email me after this to start that conversation and we can have the pre-date chat. I've never used Tinder, but I imagine it's a bit like that. Hey, how's it going? Chat on there. Which I suppose would make this webinar maybe my website, like the Tinder profile. I'm probably going to end this metaphor now because it's probably going to get dodgy territory, so we'll leave it there. But remember, this isn't stuff that we generally teach. And it's okay that we don't have a fully developed set of skills here, even if we've been in a leadership role for a long time. But if we want to be prepared for that future and to make sure that we're adding the most value that we can, I think that these skills, they're important. And I think they do need learning because this stuff isn't going anywhere. And if we're peddling and we're struggling and we're wondering why there's so much change, I would like to send this lovely sort of apocalyptic message to close off that, this isn't going anywhere. So sometimes I talk to people that say, there's been a lot of change, but, things are going to get back to normal soon. Things are going to settle down. Things aren't going to settle down. It's like when you do a budget and you do your ideal budget, but then you're like, but for the next 2 weeks, we've just got to pay off these next couple of things and we've got rego on the car. But then we'll be into the normal budget, but there's actually never a normal budget because something always comes up. This is kind of like that. Something is always going to come up. So this is not just a hump to get over. And if we look at that future of work report, this is our new normal. Change is normal now. So let's embrace it. Let's be ready to tackle it and respond to it really well. Let's upskill our teams and our leaders to be confident and have the certainty in the direction. to be able to tackle that change. Okay, team, it is 4 o'clock on the dot, so I'm going to close on time. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon and rest of your week. Thank you so much for showing up. I'm always delighted every time I run one of these and see how many of you do come and listen. I will talk to you all again soon. If you want to have a chat about leaders as strategists, please make sure to send an inquiry through online or send me an email. And registration for the next webinar will be up online at the close of this one. Thank you so much, everyone. See you later.